Naloxone use in northern New Hampshire, presented by RyanFowler, Harm Reduction Coordinator, HIV/HCV Resource Center, the Claremont Exchange.
And the North Country Health Consortium.
First, two important resources. Meet Ask Petra, your connection to substance use disorder treatment and recovery resources in northern New Hampshire and additional training opportunities.
And the Wellness and Recovery Model. WARM, a no-cost, non-clinical service for northern New Hampshire adults 18 and over in any stage of recovery or in active addiction.
Hey, good morning everyone. My name is RyanFowler and I am a person in recovery. I'm also a certified recovery support worker and I work with the HIV/HCV Resource Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire. We're an AIDS service organization and my role with the HIV/HCV Resource Center in Lebanon is that I'm the harm reduction coordinator for the Claremont Exchange. We're a syringe services program that serves both Sullivan and Grafton County, and I'm here with my friends with the North Country Health Consortium today to talk to you a little bit about naloxone, overdose prevention, and harm reduction. So the thing about naloxone is that I'm alive because of it. 3 times first responders came into my life and administered naloxone to me, reversing my opioid overdose. I am a former injection drug user, and I am somebody who is alive and in recovery for the past 5.5 years because of naloxone. I come from a social circle of people who are in recovery whose lived experience is similar to mine in that many of my friends are alive because of this medication. So it's been really cool for me to use my negative lived experiences to help others and keep people alive through the recovery process and through harm reduction and through being compassionate and there for people. So it's really a privilege to be here with you today. So harm reduction, what is it? We hear it here and there. Harm reduction kind of elicits some specific images or ideas in the mind. This image here is Dave Purchase in Tacoma, Washington, illegally distributing syringes during the HIV crisis of the 80s. And because of pioneers like Dave Purchase, people like me are now able to go out and provide harm reduction services for people that use drugs. But harm reduction is really kind of a universal concept. We use it every day. It's all around you. Harm reduction is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with risky behavior. So we use harm reduction when we put on our seatbelts, when we wear helmets, when we wear sunscreen, when we wear condoms if the mood is right. And really, it's really just a preventative measure. It's in many countries we call it healthcare or public health. I really don't wish that my friends are going to go out and jump out of a plane, but I want them to wear a parachute. I really don't want my friends to be out in the sun for 12 or 14 hours today in the mid 80s, but if they do, I want them to wear sunscreen. And I really sincerely don't want my friends to be using opiates, but if they do, I really want them to carry naloxone. And so it's harm reduction. And so harm reduction, as we get a little bit more specific, is a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with drug use. And those strategies and ideas could include abstinence-based recovery, it could include moderation management, it could include access to sterile syringes and a number of other things. But really, harm reduction just acknowledges that drug use is a thing that happens. In fact, there's no recorded human history without drug use of some kind, and it will likely continue to happen. And so harm reduction is a way to kind of insulate people from harm or structural or systemic violence. And that gets into harm reduction, capital H and capital R, which is a social movement built on the belief in and the respect for the rights of people who use drugs. Really, for the past 100 some odd years, we've really only known prohibition, a system that treats drug use as a moral issue, and we treat it with punitive measures and criminalization. We really only know that framework to address drug use, and so it's really hard to break through that and get to a place of public health and of compassion and caring for people who are really kind of vulnerable to issues in our society. And I never really imagined that I faced any sort of discrimination as a straight white middle class male from New Hampshire, but as an injection drug user, I experienced a lot of discrimination going into stores, going into healthcare, seeking treatment. For about 10 years of my life, my whole existence was criminalized, and that kept me in the shadows for a long time. I'm fortunate enough that I have parents who are in recovery and who helped me through the process, and I was able to accumulate recovery capital and access, treatment and then sustain long-term recovery. But I wouldn't be here without harm reduction. And we'll kind of get into what that looks like a little bit more later, but basically I'm alive and healthy because of these strategies and ideas. And so before I get too far into this, I really want to make a few disclaimers for folks who are hearing this. Harm reduction is not about whatever happens, happens. This is not about an uncontrolled crisis. This is about managing something that's going on. Harm reduction is not about anything goes. I'm not saying go and do whatever you want. This is a pragmatic public health approach. And harm reduction is not only meeting people where they're at, but it's taking them with us. It's supporting folks to change their behavior, and it's empowering them to make better choices through education and access to services. I can go out in the community and meet folks for harm reduction services and deliver disrespect and disempower people, but I always try to be compassionate and considerate of folks' needs and try to take them with me on the recovery journey. Harm reduction is not about helping a person who has stopped using drugs or who has never used drugs to start using. This is not about promoting or proliferating drug use, but it's creating a pathway to recovery and a pathway of recovery through harm reduction. No one has ever showed up at a harm reduction program and said, hey, I'd like to inject drugs for the first time today. This is about addressing a behavior that's going on and celebrating any positive change, any steps in the right direction. And certainly this can get a little misconstrued. Harm reduction is not condoning, endorsing, or encouraging drug use. It's just acknowledging that this is something that happens. And harm reduction is not a conversation about legalization or decriminalization, but we really would fail to address the bigger picture if we didn't look at the criminalization of people who use drugs and that role in drug-related harm. But really, legalization, decriminalization, drug policy, that's another conversation for another time. But this is just about a public health approach to supporting people. And as we get a little bit more specific, we'll see that harm reduction is a framework for working with people who use drugs or working with people who once used drugs. Harm reduction strives for any positive change. It's person-driven or client-centered. It's not about being coercive. It's about supporting people and not punishing them. And it's also a framework for understanding drugs and drug use and looking at the bigger picture. And we, with the harm reduction movement, view these issues through a lens of science and research and evidence and not morality or ideology or these kind of fixed ideas or notions of what people should or shouldn't do. And it acknowledges that some drug use is safer than other types of drug use. And so if I'm working with somebody as a recovery coach and they have stopped using fentanyl but are currently using cannabis, we're going to celebrate that today because that's a step towards improved health and wellness, living a more self-directed life, and also at a far less chance of death. And with harm reduction, all drug-related death and disease is preventable. And so as you'll see, this ties into not only prevention, but treatment and recovery. And harm reduction is kind of built within our day-to-day life. It's just a matter of kind of seeing it through that lens. And harm reduction acknowledges and addresses the context of drug use. the foundation of this kind of framework of drug set and setting is through Dr. Norman Zinberg. He released a book called Drug Set and Setting. Much of our society just views drug issues as just the substance itself, but the set is kind of like what someone brings to the table, their unique physiology, their biology, what's going on, their motivation for using the drug. And so if I ask somebody, what are the benefits from using this drug? What do you get from this drug? One person might say, well, it treats my lower back pain. And another person might say, I use drugs to make the voices in my head stop. These are two different valid reasons that someone might self-medicate, and likely two different pathways of recovery. And so it is really about honoring people's autonomy and agency and understanding that people make decisions based on their circumstances. Drug use is oftentimes seen as a normal reaction to abnormal living conditions. There are a lot of systemic issues in our society, socioeconomic, all sorts of different issues that almost necessitate self-medication. If we look at the state of things in 2020 in America, it's not so much about asking why don't you stop using drugs, but sometimes the question to ask is, why are you using these drugs and what are the benefits? And finding out what those benefits are and replacing that with more positive things. And that was largely my recovery in a nutshell, replacing negative behaviors with positive behaviors. And after a while, drug use just didn't fit into my life. And so the goal of harm reduction is to improve the health and well-being of individuals and the community around them, which I get to see every day operating a syringe services program. It's really cool to see the lights kind of come on in people and realize that they have autonomy and agency and they can improve their health and well-being, even if that doesn't mean that they're abstinent from drugs today. And harm reduction, back to that capital H and capital R harm reduction, the goal is to highlight and address the roles of discrimination due to poverty, racism, classism, sexism, social isolation, trauma, and other inequalities in drug-related harm. And so we really need to look at the bigger picture in people's lives and in their communities and look at the role of, whether that's classism, racism, sexism, homophobia, bigotry of any kind. We are all the same species. We are all here to cooperate and love one another. And the greatest illusion that man has is the illusion of disconnection and separation. We are connected to ourselves. We are part of this spaceship Earth. We're all here on the same planet to support one another. And the idea that we can cast people out based on these fictitious ideas doesn't make any sense. We need to support each other regardless of what's going on, especially in times like this where we're facing serious issues of social isolation and economic hardship. Sometimes, I've learned through providing harm reduction services that the people that need the love and compassion the most are sometimes the hardest to love. But when I take a closer look at their life, I see why they are engaging in these behaviors, because any human behavior serves a purpose. And anything human can both help and harm. And so sometimes people aren't connecting their consequences to their behaviors because their behavior is serving a purpose in their life. And that's oftentimes coping or self-soothing or these types of ideas. But we really need to stop shaming and blaming behaviors and start to help people self-actualize and realize what these behaviors are doing for them and then replace it with positive space fillers in their life. And really what that looks like is showing people dignity, respect, and empowerment. And that is really harm reduction in a nutshell. It's a movement of empowerment and showing people dignity and respect so that they have what it takes to move toward recovery. And so that's harm reduction in a nutshell. And the strategy is access to cost-free naloxone, which is why we're here, working with the North Country Health Consortium, the WARM program, and Ask Petra to ensure that anybody who is at risk of an opioid overdose has access to naloxone. Harm reduction strategies include evidence-based treatment options. So if somebody has a chronic health condition, they have a substance use disorder, and they're told, go to wherever you can get, go to whatever rehab you can find first, just go there. That's not healthcare. This is the wealthiest nation on the planet with a very expensive healthcare system. We need to give people options and honor their agency in defining what path of recovery works for them, as long as it's based in evidence and research. And so it's really about giving people multiple options, multiple pathways of recovery. Harm reduction is really a big proponent of housing first models, which is the idea that if you give highly vulnerable at-risk populations housing without contingencies on behavior, their services work a lot better, their quality of life improves, and they're accounted for and checked in on. And so you see housing first in Canada, Europe, and parts of the United States, but in a nation with over 500,000 homeless people right now, we need to be looking at housing first models for those who are hitting these unbearable bottoms from their substance use disorder. We need to collectively raise the bottom of the population of people who use drugs and reduce stigma against people who use drugs or engage in sex work. And in doing so, we're going to empower the recovery community and keep people alive and well. But harm reduction oftentimes focuses on people who fall through the cracks of services and who are oftentimes don't have their needs met because they're a little more complex or have a little bit more going on. And so harm reduction is really just this incredible social safety net below the diminished social safety net that we see here in America. Harm reduction is really importantly focusing on drug policy reform, criminal justice reform, looking at alternative sentencing, ways to keep people out of jail and prison. We want to call a substance use disorder a healthcare issue or a disease or a chronic health condition. We treat it like a crime. So from Jump Street, we are addressing this as a moral issue. If you engage in this behavior, use these substances, you are a criminal, and that looks a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. But we really need to address this through a public health framework, and that's why harm reduction is so successful right now, because we're talking about health issues. We're not talking about moral issues. Of course, harm reduction is kind of synonymous with syringe services programs or needle exchange programs. My work with the Claremont Exchange is, providing sterile supplies and taking used syringes off the street, providing referrals, case management, HIV, Hep C testing, and the evidence shows that folks are 3 times more likely to access treatment if they're engaged with one of these programs. A newer harm reduction strategy is the provision of on-site drug checking programs. So that's giving folks fentanyl test strips or reagent kits to test what's in their bag and see what drugs they're using, because it doesn't come with a label. And so in prohibition in a criminal market, you're basically dependent on organized crime at the end of the day for your supplies. And some people see it as medication, some people see it as recreation. It doesn't come with a label, so folks need the ability to test what it is they're putting into their body. And harm reduction's been in the news quite a bit lately, focusing on the concept of supervised use, where folks can go into a facility and use under medical supervision. Right now, here in New Hampshire, in the United States, when I say supervised use, I'm talking about creating a culture of people who don't use alone and carry naloxone, because anytime one of my friends died of a fatal overdose, they were alone and behind a closed door because of stigma. So we really need to reduce that stigma against people and allow for open and honest conversations so that people are accounted for, so that, imagine if I hadn't received that 3rd dose of naloxone in 2014, I wouldn't have had this past 5.5 years of recovery. And dead people don't enter recovery. Really all you need is the ability to breathe and a pulse. And with harm reduction, we can prevent 70,000 deaths a year. And these are really kind of basic concepts that really need to be promoted. We really need to be promoting good ideas and ignoring what's not worked for the past 100 some odd years of prohibition. And so I'm here talking about drug use, and much of the world would like to see people who use drugs in recovery that looks a lot like mine. Happy, healthy, living a full self-directed life. But SAMHSA's working definition of recovery is a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. So for some people, their full potential includes medication-assisted recovery. For some people, reaching their full potential includes using illicit substances or alcohol. Each person is their own autonomous individual who has a different idea of health and wellness, a different capacity for living a self-directed life, and has a different full potential. And harm reduction oftentimes shows people their full potential, because oftentimes we tell people, you need to quit using to access our services. In order for us to help you, we need you to do away with most of your symptoms. And that's not healthcare. People can reach their full potential and live a self-directed life without going to a residential rehab or without going to fellowship meetings or things like that we think are synonymous with recovery. But if we look at the SAMHSA's working definition of recovery, there's nothing in there about clean time or sobriety or abstinence. It's just about improving health and wellness. And harm reduction, I can tell you for a fact, is a really strong vehicle for that. And I get to see it every day. And I consider what I do for work a privilege, going out and meeting very marginalized people and watching the lights come on and watching them, move through life and, get the education they were never given about how to be safe, how to be healthy, and, how to survive this thing. And so oftentimes in our society, when we think of substance use, we think of it as, dangerous, chaotic, addicted drug use or abstinent. We really failed to address that the majority of people who use illicit drugs in America use in moderation. We know that most people use alcohol in moderation. The same thing goes for other types of drugs. And so we really need to think of this as a continuum where we are all born abstinent of drug-taking behavior. Like, we are born and we do not choose to take drugs. From that point forward, many people will experiment, and that might become occasional or social use. Most people mature and age out, and for those that kind of get into heavy or dangerous use, evidence shows that a lot of folks have, what is being called kind of native recovery or self-facilitated recovery, where their hormones change, they mature, they have kids, they get married, they buy a home, and drug use just doesn't make sense because their needs are met by society and the world around them. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about my 10 years of chaotic drug use, and really when you boil it down, drugs did for me what society wasn't doing for me. They gave me relief for my anxiety disorder, they helped me connect with people, they helped me sleep, they helped me socialize. And I had no concept of addiction or mental health as a 14-year-old who was experimenting with drugs. I wish I got the education I got in rehab at 12 or 14, but I had to go through 10 years of not great life to be informed about mental health and addiction in rehab at 25. And so we really need to be innovating prevention, because to be frank, if programs like DARE and primary prevention were working, we wouldn't be here. I probably wouldn't be recording this video. We really need to innovate and be including harm reduction for young people and providing real education about the facts regarding substance use and substance use disorder. Because we are talking about a chronic health issue, and with any chronic health issue, there's a continuum of reducing symptoms, increasing symptoms, and any step in the right direction is, positive, is great. And, if you think about any chronic health issue, you can put in whatever one you want. This makes a lot of sense, right? Whether it be diabetes, asthma, on and on and on. And for a lot of, my friends, they sit on the abstinence steps. Some of my friends sit on the moderation step. And it doesn't really matter. You're in recovery when you say you are. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, because that person is doing the best they can in that moment, and they can do better. We need to address that. Two things can be true. People right now are doing the best they can, and with a little bit of empowerment, compassion, and education, they can do better. And so we really want to celebrate any positive change or any decreased risk of death and disease. And so talked quite a bit about kind of harm reduction as a concept, a little bit about substance use, but we're here to talk primarily about naloxone and opioid overdoses and how to prevent them. And so basically I did these for a while, and I realized that a lot of folks have never actually taken an opioid or don't really know what an opioid is. And so just real quick, an opioid is any agent that enters the body and binds to the opioid receptors in the body and brain and creates a response. Generally speaking, there are 4 classes of opioids. There are endogenous opioids, and so those are naturally produced by the body, sometimes called endorphins. In fact, the term endorphin was coined as an abbreviation for endogenous morphine. So your body produces its own opioids. So if you bang your knee or break your hip, your body produces painkillers, but sometimes that's not enough to address physical pain. And for the past 5,000 or so years, people have used opium alkaloids, external or exogenous opiates from the opium poppy to relieve pain, for recreation. Actually, the first recorded human history of the use of opium was considered to be religious or spiritual, and it was this idea that pain had a big role in human life, and they found that if they extracted opium from these poppies that grew in southern Iraq, that they had the ability to treat pain. And for the large majority of history, opioids and opiates were celebrated as innovations in medicine. They made life better, they made life more bearable. And then came later on, late 1800s, early 1900s, and then through the semi-synthetic opioids, heroin, also known as diacetylmorphine. So that's taking the opium alkaloid and synthesizing it, putting it through like a man-made process to create things that we know as hydrocodone, oxycodone, buprenorphine. But really today, what we've seen with innovations in medicine and opioids are the fully synthetic opioids. Methadone was created in World War II as an alternative to morphine, long-acting, lasts almost 24 hours, really great pathway of recovery. We need to ensure that folks with an opioid use disorder have methadone as an option in their community, because methadone is still considered the gold standard to treat opioid use disorder. But we really need to innovate how it's dispensed in America to really help more people. But really what we're seeing with the overdose crisis is fentanyl and related fentanyl analogs. And those are very potent, they're very short acting, and they're very deadly. Fentanyl, we'll get into in a minute, but just to kind of give you a broad overview of what opioids do. Basically, they enter the body and they create a response. They block pain signals, they slow breathing, and they also produce calming antidepressant effects. They can cause drowsiness, nervousness. They fire off on really crucial parts of the human brain linked to survival, and it facilitates the release of a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine does a lot of things in the body and in the brain, but really what it does is it reinforces life-sustaining behaviors. And so we're given dopamine every day when we eat food, drink water, care for our children, seek shelter, have sex, anything that's gonna make the species survive through, the brain is programmed to give us dopamine. That's kind of our reward response system. The thing about drugs like opioids or oftentimes stimulants as well is they facilitate the release of more dopamine than most people would ever have in their lifetime, even from sex. And so over time, continued use of opioids reinforces that behavior, and the brain starts to associate taking opioids as a life-sustaining activity. And when I learned this in rehab at 25, I realized that that's why I was sleeping in a vehicle with no gas. I couldn't feed myself. I could barely keep myself hydrated, but I got up $80 to $100 every day for heroin because my brain associated taking drugs with a survival mechanism. And that's why the use of medication-assisted recovery using buprenorphine and methadone are crucial, because if folks have spent years accustomed to opioids in their brain, then that's going to be sometimes a long process of moving away from chemical dependency. And for a handful of my friends, they are ecstatic that they will be on agonist therapies, Suboxone or methadone, for the rest of their life. It is what it is. Some people need opiates, and that's just that. That's the best they can do. But really, it's the supply that has been really tainted and poisoned, and it's just kind of this natural thing that seems to have occurred. And opioids, really important to highlight, have a varying duration of effects and potency. And so when I was using heroin, diacetylmorphine, I could use once, and I pretty much had like a 4, 6, or 8 hour window where I was not in withdrawal. I was functioning. I could go work a kitchen gig, I could go run errands, I could do what I had to do, and then I would go into withdrawal 6 to 8 hours later. And so I was using 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 times a day. With fentanyl, it lasts about 2 hours or sometimes less with some of the new analogs. And so folks are injecting every 2 hours, reporting they can't sleep through the night because the fentanyl is so short-acting and addictive. And this causes a lot of issues, as you can imagine, especially for injection drug users. And so fentanyl is really deadly. Minute amount in its purest form could be deadly. I will tell you, and this information is backed by any large agency, that fentanyl is not transdermal. If it simply gets on your skin, you're not at risk for an overdose. But the thing to remember is you want to wash it off with soap and water and not use alcohol-based hand sanitizer, because the alcohol-based hand sanitizer could make the fentanyl transdermal. And just to kind of lay this to rest, if fentanyl was transdermal, you wouldn't need to inject it. Okay, the media latch onto this idea because if fentanyl is airborne, like it's a cloud of it and you breathe it in, you are at risk. But the big thing is don't get fentanyl on your mucous membranes. If you're at risk for an overdose or you've been exposed, absolutely call 911. But we really need to reduce stigma against people who use opiates. And I feel that the media saying that fentanyl is transdermal has translated to a lot of kind of social distancing prior to COVID, and I kind of realized what I was saying right there. So basically, you need a tiny bit of fentanyl to overdose, and what people are using, end user people that are using opioids, is fentanyl with about 99% binding agent or cut, and so that makes it inconsistent in potency, and people have a really hard time measuring their dose accurately, and so it's pretty easy to get too much of fentanyl in your body. It depresses the brain from the front all the way to the back, and it depresses the brain stem. And so an opioid overdose is simply when too much of an opioid overwhelms the system and suppresses the body's urge to breathe. So the brain stem tells your body to do things like digest food, grow your hair and fingernails, all these kind of automated responses, including breathing. And so an opioid overdose is just the body not having the urge to breathe. And so depending on the type of opioid and the amount, an overdose can happen suddenly, as you kind of see in movies, or it could evolve over several hours. If there's other drugs in the system, somebody could use an overdose a little bit later. There's no cookie cutter approach. People have different biology, different physiology, different tolerances, and so overdoses could look different person to person. And so how to recognize an opioid overdose? There's some pretty telltale characteristics. Lack of consciousness, but more importantly, unresponsive to outside stimuli. And so, the yell, the verbal, hey, wake up, that doesn't work. The physical, the shake, that doesn't work. The person could be awake but unable to talk or kind of incoherent. Their breathing will be shallow. It could sound like a gurgling or snoring sound. Their complexion could be pale or ashen, depending on their complexion or race could look different, but kind of ashen or bluish. Lack of oxygen, remember, we're really talking about lack of oxygen in the body. They could be vomiting. Their body could be limp or rigid, depending on the opioid. Their pulse will be slow, erratic, or not present. And if you lift their eyelids, their pupil will be pinned and unresponsive to light. It could be any combination of these. It could be one or the other. It could look different person to person. But these are the characteristics you're looking for if you suspect that somebody may be overdosing on opioids. And so if somebody is experiencing those symptoms, we want to administer naloxone as soon as possible. But what is naloxone? Many people know it as the name brand Narcan. Naloxone's been around for a long time under many different names, different manufacturers, but primarily what folks have access to are the intranasal kits of Narcan. That's the type you squirt in the nose. But what is the medication naloxone? Naloxone hydrochloride is an opioid antagonist, so it blocks those opioid receptors that opioids are attached to in the brain. They reverse the effects of opioids and can reverse an overdose, by binding to those receptor sites and removing opioids and reversing the effects of opioids, primarily the suppression of breathing. It is non-scheduled. Anybody can carry it, possess it, and use it. Naloxone is temperature sensitive, so you want to keep it at room temperature, away from direct sunlight, and you don't want to leave it in your vehicle, especially in New England where our temperatures are crazy. Ideally, it should be stored between 59 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. It can survive up to 104 degrees short term, and it can get colder too, but you don't want to let it freeze or get too hot for an extended period of time because it degrades the medication. And important to remember, naloxone has no potential for misuse. No one is voluntarily giving themselves naloxone. This whole idea of a Narcan party that was kind of proliferated by the media was laughable to my friends and I, because getting administered naloxone was one of the worst experiences of my life. So imagine that you are awakened from a very deep sleep and you have no idea what's going on. You're surrounded by people. You're physically in a lot of pain. You're hot and you're cold, sweating and shivering. It feels like the top layer of your skin is gone, and you have no memory recall because your entire brain was just shut off from the front to the back. And then 0 to 60, your brain comes back on, and you're basically having a painful anxiety attack. No one is doing that to themselves. You know, if people are going to have a party where there's opioids, have the Narcan, carry the naloxone, know how to respond and know how to use it. So this is a neat little picture of naloxone coming into the brain. There's those opioid receptors, and they attach to those receptors and kick those opioids off, thus reversing the effects and giving the body the urge to breathe again. Again, oxygen's the name of this game. There's a couple different varieties of naloxone available. Like I said, primarily we're going to be seeing the name brand Narcan, the intranasal kits. Super easy to use, really user-friendly. I have yet to find a reason why not to give this medication to somebody of any age. There's really should be universal access at this point during the overdose crisis. So how to respond to an opioid overdose. It's the nature of this training is teaching you how to use naloxone. So naloxone is not your first response. You should not see somebody who is exhibiting those symptoms and hit them with your Narcan first. You want to use verbal stimulation. You then want to give them a sternal rub, which is basically taking these kind of middle knuckles of your finger or something close to it and rubbing their sternum. And if you do this to someone else, they will experience a lot of nerve signals going up to the brain. If somebody doesn't respond to a sternal rub, you're going to want to get medical professionals there. This is a really good tool to have regardless of the situation. I don't shake, I don't hit, I don't throw, I go sternal rub. That's really the easiest way to do to really honor someone's dignity. And if they don't respond to the verbal or the sternal rub, I'm going to call 911 and administer my naloxone. If somebody is potentially overdosing, I want to clear a crowd. I want to make sure it's just myself responding to the overdose, maybe one person. When I've responded to overdoses, best case scenario, I have somebody calling 911 while I'm administering the naloxone, because the sooner we get this in their body, the better, because we want to prevent brain damage, other organ damage, and make sure this person is alive. And so this might trigger a lot of responses for people. It could be really traumatizing, but just remember, it's really simple with these Narcan kits. You peel it open, you place it in their nose, and you press the trigger. So we're gonna peel open the package here. And so they come in these nice boxes, and the cool thing about these boxes is that they have instructions right there. And so we're gonna peel open these packages. I carry mine like this, rubber banded together. It fits in my backpack or briefcase or first aid kit, and it's a little more ambiguous, or it's a little less noticeable than this big thing that says Narcan. So I'm gonna peel open the package here. It's just nice and easy. I'm not gonna read this because I've already taken the training. I have this guy here. And I'm going to place this in their nostril. And the thing to remember is that you want them on their back or facing upright so that this medication is squirted well into their nasal cavity. And then you're going to press the trigger. And the big thing to remember is that you don't want to press this before you place it in there. It doesn't take a lot of force to press this trigger. And when you press this, all 4 milligrams of naloxone is going to squirt. And if this was a live one, this would squirt right in the air. So you're going to peel it open, place it in their nostril, and press the trigger. The hardest part is waiting, though. This medication, taken intranasally, takes about 3 minutes to even start working in the brain. And so best case scenario, they're going to regain consciousness, their breathing is going to improve, and then EMS arrives because 911 has been called. First responders are going to come and assess the situation, which there could be a lot more going on than an overdose, so it's always important to call 911. And so if they respond, let them know what happened. They're not going to have much memory recall. They're not going to have their faculties about them. They're not going to be making the most informed decisions in that moment. So sometimes less is more when they immediately come to. Let them know what happened. Hey, I gave you naloxone and you came back. You may still overdose because naloxone only lasts 30 to 90 minutes. And so what's happened in the past is that folks have been revived by naloxone, and then 30 to 90 minutes later, those same opioids that were in their system reattach to those opioid receptors, and they've actually overdosed again. And so it's really important to seek medical attention. And if their breathing is improving, but they're still unresponsive, you can put them into the recovery position, which is a really good tool to have. There's a lot of great trainings on this, but basically the idea is to put them on their side so that they're stable and they're facing out and down so that if they vomit, they don't choke on their vomit. This is really great if somebody drinks too much at the party this summer or what have you. If anybody who's at risk of vomiting, they should really be put into the recovery position, also known as the rescue position. And if their breathing doesn't improve, you'll have to breathe for them if you're comfortable. This isn't for everyone, but I will say that this is a really crucial tool to learn rescue breathing and more importantly, do a full CPR training. But basically the idea is that if somebody has been out for a bit or at all and they don't have oxygen to their brain, they're experiencing brain injury. Also known as an anoxic brain injury, and we're seeing an increase in brain injuries from folks who have survived opioid overdoses from lack of oxygen to the brain. And so naloxone gives the body the urge to breathe again. While you're waiting that 3 minutes for the naloxone to hit the brain, you could use rescue breathing. And so what that looks like is it's pretty straightforward, also known as mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. You want to wear gloves if possible and have a CPR mask if possible, but you want to do a sweep of their mouth, make sure there's nothing in there that they're going to choke on or you're going to choke on. You're going to lift their head back, you're going to lift their chin, and you're going to take 2 full breaths of your oxygen and blow it directly into their lungs through their mouth. A lot of folks hold their nose to get more oxygen in there, and what you'll see is that their chest will rise and the color will come back into their face. And you can keep somebody alive like this indefinitely. I actually have a friend whose life was saved by strictly rescue breaths, no naloxone at all. Severe overdose, no naloxone, did not feel comfortable calling 911. Rescue breaths save people's lives and prevent brain injuries. And you can give one of your lungs full of oxygen to a person every 5 seconds, pretty much indefinitely breathing for them. And that's going to reduce a lot of harm in this situation. Basically, when EMS arrives on the scene, they're going to use a bag valve mask to pump oxygen into them. And you can do that. And the big thing to remember, as you can see here, you're going to watch for their chest to rise, make sure you're doing it right. And if you're certified and they stop breathing completely, you can use chest compressions and full CPR to try to jumpstart the cardiovascular system. And really what I want to highlight with the rescue breaths is the importance of CPR masks or rescue breathing masks. These guys are about $1 a piece, give or take. And basically what it is it's a one-way air port. It's really straightforward. This side only, single use. Basically, you want to put this over their mouth and blow into it. This is going to protect you from many pathogens, many cooties. I'm not sure if this will protect against the COVID-19 virus, but it's better to have this than nothing at all. I've both used this and not used this, and I was really upset when I didn't have one of these on hand and I had to give mouth-to-mouth during an overdose. I carry this everywhere I go. This is really cool. They come on keychains, various other things, but basically I give out my Narcan with a rescue breathing mask because I kind of went over that. So now what? We have given the naloxone, 2 or 3 minutes has passed, and there's no change. Luckily, these Narcan kits come with 2 doses of naloxone, so you just repeat the peel, place, and press. And hopefully, at this point, EMS will arrive, depending on where you are. But just for a quick recap for folks, we're going to know the signs of an overdose and look for those signs. We're going to use stimulation first. Remember, naloxone is not your first response. Verbal stimulation, physical stimulation. We're going to call 911 and then administer naloxone, and we're going to evaluate their breathing. And if you're comfortable, we're going to perform rescue breaths. If they're not conscious but improving, we're going to remember our rescue position or recovery position. And if they're conscious, we're going to remember supportive messaging, let them know what happened, and remember that that first hour or so is really not the time for an intervention. They're not going to have their faculties about them yet. Give them some time to come back, offer them some water. Nasal naloxone tastes really bad, and they're probably going to want a drink of water. But also ask them what they want. Ask them what they need. And remember, too, with calling 911, New Hampshire has a Good Samaritan law, which basically protects folks from prosecution for amounts of drugs and paraphernalia at the scene of an overdose. And so this protects folks from being arrested at the scene of an overdose. It encourages folks to call 911 because what was happening is folks were so afraid to call that people were dying of very preventable deaths. And so remember that there are Good Samaritan laws to protect you. And when you call 911, you don't need to say overdose. You could say that you found somebody who's unresponsive and they're not breathing. I'm trained to administer naloxone and I administered it and they came back. You don't need to give more information than necessary in that moment, but generally when police and fire and EMS arrive on the scene, they want to help the person just as much as you do. They're not arriving at overdoses trying to arrest people. We want to keep people alive and get people towards recovery. So it's really crucial to be calling 911 during these overdose incidences. And the U.S. Surgeon General Jerome Adams, for the first time in 13 years, released a kind of blanket public health advisory 2 or 3 years back that basically said that during this crisis, any American should be carrying naloxone because we're losing a lot of people to opiates. And I'm sure you all know that if you're watching this. So that's how we would respond to an overdose, but I want to get into a little bit of how someone can reduce their risk for overdose. And so if we know somebody, or if you're watching this and you use opioids, who's at risk for an overdose, there are some things that people can do in their day-to-day life to improve their health and wellness and reduce their risk for overdose. The big one is don't use alone. It takes 2 people and a kit of naloxone to have a supervised consumption site. Really staggering use with someone else, knowing the signs of an overdose, but not sharing supplies because we want to reduce disease as well as death. And so don't use alone, fix with a friend, have someone to check in on you. Neverusealone.org is a really great resource for folks who might be using alone for a number of reasons. Folks, when they're getting a supply, should always try a tiny tester amount first. You can do more later, but you can't do less afterwards. You can put more in you, but you can't take it out of you. And so go slow, take your time. If you're gonna get high, don't die. There are ways that you can use moderation management techniques to, control what's going into your body. And wait to use until you feel in control because fear causes mistakes, and people should think about their setting in which they're using drugs as well to reduce harm. And the big one also is not mixing drugs. Seriously, like don't mix alcohol and benzos with anything. If you look at the DMI data from the state, you'll see that most fatal overdoses are not just one drug, but a combination of drugs. Oftentimes, alcohol, benzos, opioids, various combinations, but go one at a time, really important to tell people, And limit use while sick, because remember that an overdose event is regarding the lack of oxygen to the brain. And so if you have an illness that affects your lungs and heart, you're at a higher risk for overdose risk. And in the times of COVID-19, and especially during flu season, it's important to remember that if you have a respiratory issue, you're at a higher risk for overdose. And so across the board, anybody watching this, drink more water. Drink plenty of water. I think we as Americans need to drink a lot more water, improving our health and wellness. So if we're drinking water, it prevents sickness, increases blood flow, increases blood oxygen, and you'll feel better. And for my folks at for my clients with the Claremont Exchange, I tell them if you drink more water, you'll have better access to your veins. You'll be more hydrated. You'll have to inject less. Water is harm reduction. And folks can change the way that they use. And so if they inject, they can try snorting or smoking. What a lot of syringe service programs have done throughout the country is they offer Pyrex pipes alongside syringes. And what they found is that folks who inject their drugs may choose a proper pipe to smoke their drugs rather than injecting it because they've never had the option of using a safer Pyrex pipe. And so folks, if given the option, will improve their health and wellness by changing how they use their drugs. Folks can test their drugs for the presence of fentanyl using fentanyl test strips. You can get those at btnx.com. I also, we give them out at the Claremont Exchange for folks so that they can test their supply for fentanyl. Basically, any pill or powder has been shown that it can have fentanyl in it, and so we give out fentanyl test strips, a little flyer about the information, and then some water so that folks can mix their drugs with water and then see if there's fentanyl present in their supply. And this is a really great tool for folks. And last but certainly not least, carry naloxone and know the signs of an overdose. Anybody, anytime can save a life with this medication. This is me in front of Safe Harbor Recovery Center dispensing free fentanyl test strips. This, at the time, a few years ago, was a little radical, a little bit edgy, but this is a really effective tool so that, folks who are using drugs, especially who are opioid naive, can test their pills or powders for the presence of fentanyl. And this is a public health response, and it gives people the sense of agency and autonomy. And in engaging in this process, they're really thinking about the risks associated with this. This can be kind of a behavioral therapy, if you will, in that new supply, let's check it. And over time, this has seemed to change the drug market and the drug supply. And so if people find out that their substance has opioids in it and they don't want it, they can go back to their vendor or their supplier and say, hey, we don't want this in here, do something about it. And it's like any other economy, any other market. It's free, it's self-regulating, other entities regulate it, but this is really an important tool to remember as we trudge through this opioid crisis. And so how do we obtain naloxone? A lot of pharmacies in New Hampshire will dispense it without a prescription, a lot of Rite Aids especially. Medicaid will pay for a prescription to naloxone. Of course, your local doorways of our hub and spoke model to access doorways in any place in New Hampshire, you're simply pick up the phone and dial 211. It's a great resource for a number of things. And for folks in the North Country, the phone numbers to your 2 doorways in the upper third of the state are listed here if you want to contact your local doorway and find out more. Naloxone is available through syringe services programs throughout the state. Most of the southern tier of New Hampshire has active syringe service programs from the seacoast out to Keene. The northernmost syringe service program in New Hampshire is the Claremont Exchange, which serves both Sullivan and Grafton County. And so you can look up through New Hampshire DHHS's website which syringe service programs are available to you. But especially for our North Country folks, there is a couple new resources coming out. that are now up and running and ready to help you. And one is the Wellness and Recovery Model Program, which can be reached at 603-259-1730. And then a brand new resource to help folks in the northern tier of the state is Ask Petra. And you can go to askpetra.org or call 603-259-1729 and connect with a live person for access to not only naloxone, but recovery resources, referrals, case management, a friend on the phone. Really anything recovery and overall wellness can be reached through Ask Petra or the Wellness and Recovery Model, also known as WARM. And for folks throughout the country, you can go to nextdistro.org and see what's available for mail order harm reduction supplies. And a really great resource is naloxoneforall.org/New Hampshire. Gives you a pretty comprehensive list of not only naloxone resources, but harm reduction resources. And there are other agencies that are dispensing naloxone. It's readily available and free of cost for anyone in New Hampshire who's going to be accessing it. So please, representing myself, my friends, my family, it's really important to be carrying this medication and know how to use it. So that's my presentation. Again, I thank you very much for taking the time to learn more about this. My email is listed right here. For more information on the HIV/HCV Resource Center in Lebanon, it's h2rc.org. We provide case management for folks who are living with HIV and Hep C. We provide on-site testing for diseases, syringe services in both Vermont and New Hampshire in the Upper Valley. And really grateful to my friends up here in the North Country Health Consortium for having me come up and talk to y'all about harm reduction and naloxone. So with that, I thank you.